Thank you, Kathy, thank you. It's when somebody reads out the thing that you write on LinkedIn that you realise you really do talk some crap. So hopefully I'll aim to be more decisive with my speaking today. As Kathy said, it's going to be quite an interactive session, so I don't want to do much talking, and hopefully you'll be getting a bit out of it. I want to talk to you today about making game-based learning work for you. I, as Kathy mentioned, work at Warwick University. I'm a researcher there, and part of that research is about how we can use game-based learning and gamification to encourage participation in learning. And I'm also in industry as well, so I build and sell this stuff for a living. On the sort of headings of this session in the little pamphlet, these 5 things, I think one of them might have changed slightly because I didn't like the way I wrote it, sorry. These are the sorts of things that I want to talk about today, and although the first one I'm going to force on you, the other 4, I kind of want you to tell me what you think is interesting, where you want to go with it. So I really hope that out the back of this session, we're going to get a bit of a feel for the practical applications of games, the research behind games, why you might use them, and the big answer I'm searching for, the big question that I've got at the moment is, why is game-based learning on the periphery of things? Why isn't it more mainstream? I feel that game-based learning is very much an edge topic in our area, and I kind of wonder why. So that's my personal want after this. I would really love some of your feedback today to help me sort of get my thoughts together on that. So in your groups, I'm going to do a few exercises. The first one is this one. Now, to try and understand a little bit more about why it is that games have got a bit of a bad rap, I've kind of coined this phrase, the hierarchy of parental acceptability. And one of the things that I've always thought is that there are certain activities that are more acceptable than others to being serious work activities or serious learning activities or just serious activities in that. So in your little groups, we've got 8 activities from reading a book to talking on the phone to playing a computer game. And I'd like you just to sketch out, if you can see a scale from the most acceptable to the least acceptable in terms of your elders, not yourself. What would your elders think about this list? Where would your elders put reading a book or playing a computer game from most acceptable to least acceptable? Let's have a chat about it for a couple of minutes. Who feels very confident? Which table feels very confident in their hierarchy? Anybody? Where are we sort of talking? Give me an idea. What's the most acceptable activity?
We stopped. We went down this route then, but then we stopped because what we actually came to realise is we put reading a book at an acceptable end of the scale.
Yes.
And we put playing a computer game at the other end, and then the others were in between.
Yes.
Then we actually stopped and thought, reading a book, watching TV, talking on the phone, doing Sudoku could all still be computer-based activities.
You've thought about it more than I did, which is always a sign of success. But I do enjoy these intellectual conversations. Okay, anybody agree with that? That actually, yeah, no, kinda.
We didn't go down they're all potentially confusable, but we felt that the assumption that just because you said, our elders,
Yes.
what would they judge? Well, in this day and age, I don't think that's terribly fair or relevant, because my mum spends a lot of time playing games on the computer, and my dad isn't there making stuff and doing it far more than I am. So that reference point is kind of irrelevant these days. And then when you look at the activities on there, it depends what you're reading, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you're reading
50 Shades of Grey. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah.
And if you're playing a computer game that's got a genuine learning intention, then you reverse the comparison. So actually, they're all equal. They can all be great, they can be bad, with the exception of Sudoku, which I hate.
They're all equal. Agree? Disagree? Disagree. How violently?
Very violent.
Well, then you must tell us why.
We have a very clear point of view on this table. None of this fanning around. Reading a book, number 1, most acceptable thing.
Yeah.
Playing a game, bottom of the list, definitely out of order.
It's by design.
Below the book comes playing the sport. Below the sport comes probably Sudoku. Below that the phone, then watching the telly, then browsing online, and then chatting. I think that we can have that. We must be right.
Well, we've got the answer. It's a round of applause for the answer. Unbelievable. It's not the answer. Don't. So I think it's one of those things. I used to be of the opinion that you were probably right in that sort of thinking. And actually, there's some deliberate choice architecture in my positioning of reading a book over there and a computer game down here. You know, I probably think that's a way that some would go. I love the idea that they're all born equal, to be honest with you, and that there's nothing inherently bad or good about any of them. There's a context that's each one of them. And I even love the idea more that actually they're all the same thing. But one of the things, this is getting down to part of the things, I've always thought that maybe the reason that computer games haven't become more mainstream for learning is that there is some fundamental block to say that they are not a valid activity, that it's not a good activity, it's not something like that. But I'm not necessarily feeling that that's how you think about it. I'm not necessarily sure that's true. So if that's not the case, that's not the blocker, then what is, or what else are we getting into to do that? So I've got another exercise for you. And we'll just keep doing them till we get it right. There will be badges. So this one, I want you to have a debate about this for a couple minutes on your table. You've each got a copy of this on your table. Now, whether or not you agree or disagree with my scales or not, we'll come to that problem later. But what I'd like you to do is to think about this and position yourself on this grid. You can do it individually or as a group if you happen to have consensus. But along the bottom axis here, I've got a very binary question in both circumstances. They're yes or no. Computer games appeal to everybody. Yes or no. And at the side, there is a game for every learning requirement. Yes or no. I'm not necessarily saying that it exists. I'm saying that there could be a game for every learning requirement. Yes or no. Binary decisions. And use those to plot yourself on my little 2x2 matrix. A couple of minutes. You all deserve an experience point. Not you, Jam. OK. So there was broad consensus, and everyone agreed that was a good question. I got away with that. Look at that. Look at that. Suckers. OK. So who would be brave enough to suggest that they, in this room of all rooms, are a skeptic? Boo. OK. It's not that. I thought there'd be more. I thought there'd be more. You are. We'll come back to you there.
Skeptics because of the way in which
it's the phrase.
because computer games appeal to everyone. No, they don't.
Skeptic. Boo. Splitter.
But we know that that's the case. It's not an opinion. It's a fact. No, it's not.
Hey, let's see.
So computer games appeal to everyone. Okay, you might can appeal to everyone in there to make it clearer. Not everybody uses a computer.
Yeah, well, it's a good point. It's a good point. We're going to come back to this. We are going to come back. Who's a gamer? Who's a gamer?
No, I'm a gamer in real life, not there.
Not there. Just in real life. So we have slightly more gamers than we do skeptics. Who's a designer? Yeah, kind of figured with this audience we'd be mostly in the I can solve your problems. It might not be a game. Sort of. And who is a game designer? Yeah! Your hand's gone up at least twice, man. Okay, well, yeah, okay, let's not crude. So is it a valid question? I mean, it's interesting, and if you did happen to put your hand up as a skeptic, maybe a little bit afterwards, maybe over a drink later, have a chat. Who was a skeptic? Who was a game designer? Go and have an argument later. Because I think there's some really interesting things in there. And I mean, obviously it's divisive in terms of the wording and things like that. But it's trying to tease out sorts of things there about perhaps we're getting into a bit more of a philosophical debate, things like that, than anything else. Computer games appeal to everyone. Some computer games appeal to everyone. I don't know. But is it inherent in that? I think actually the most unfair part about all of this is suggesting that computer games are born equal, that all games are just sort of one. And actually, that sort of brings me back to this sort of whole game-based learning routine, that actually game-based learning is this one set of stuff. And I kind of think to myself, well, it's just meaningless in that sort of range of things, because there is such an array of different types of games, different sorts of games, those that work on computers, those that don't, and everything else like that, that I believe that maybe you could nick computer off, because you might be right about some people who just don't use computers. But the games appeal to everybody? I think they have the potential to, personally. So what I want to talk about a little bit is about different types of games that I've personally used for learning, and think about how those might break down into things. So I'm just going to speak for a few minutes, then we'll do something where you get to speak. Promise. So these are my own taxonomy. They're not really in any hierarchy, to be honest with you. These are just different sorts of games that I've identified with down the years. Drill and practice games, serious games, COTS, and ARGs. Does anybody know what all 4 of those things is? You know what COTS or ARGs are, anybody? Yeah, minority. Okay, we'll talk about them. We'll talk about them. I'll show you, shall I? So, dangerous. I'm switching screens. Told you it was dangerous. So, the first one was drill and practice games. And increasingly, I'm seeing a lot of research that suggests that drill and practice games can be quite good when it comes to reaching simple learning outcomes. Drill and practice games tend to be very simple, straightforward games that you play in repetition in order to foster rote retention. And you see these sorts of very simple interactions in all sorts of e-learning already. They probably don't even call them a game-based learning thing at that point. But they also come outside of the sphere and into others. Here's one I built earlier. So this one's very, very simple game. This one, for how many of you are 11 to 13-year-old girls? Okay, you're not going to like this, but so this is for a website we built called Pony Prep, which is a big game-based website. It's got 100,000 youngsters on it, so it's fairly popular. But some of the elements that we teach them here, I'm not going to play the game, I'll just suck at it. But basically, we're starting to teach them about the rhythms of a horse, about trots, about canters, and things like that. And the first part of that is a total rip-off of Guitar Hero to get them thinking about what's going on in the background. And so there's a noise going on, you can't really see it, and you're meant to try and hit the keys in the right place to earn some scores. Very, very simple, repetitive, leveled, and gets people going through things. That's what I'd call a drill and practice game. And there's significant evidence. There is a paper by a guy whose name I can barely pronounce, called Simon Eggenfeldt-Nielsen, who's a big noise in serious games. And he's written quite a comprehensive analysis to suggest that these sorts of games can be more effective than other sorts of interactions or even face-to-face stuff, given the right design. There's quite a lot of evidence to say this stuff works. But it's only around a very minor part of things, around rote retention, around simple processes, around very behaviorist sorts of things. So serious games was my second one there. And serious games is a very big field. Serious games is unfairly large as a term, to be honest with you. And most of you would be familiar with the term serious games. So I would make distinction within the field of serious games into 2 broad categories. One is a serious game for situated learning. And in a serious game for situated learning, then generally speaking, we're looking to create an immersive, probably 3D environment, which replicates the real world. And it tends to be that the situation is significant. It's a significant part of the learning process. America's Army is one of the oldest and perhaps most well-known things. Anybody come across America's Army? Few nods. So, I mean, this was right there on the homepage. Learn more at Go Army. Oh, and sign up. So, this was a very big game. It still is quite a big game. 3D online shooter. But it had a serious bent to it. They claim, whether they do or not, that the Army actually use it for training purposes, for tactics and things like that, which, of course, is perhaps part of the marketing spiel that gets people into it. But it's really also a vehicle for recruiting. So this actually looks to situate learning in something that's realistic to life. You tend to find serious games for situated learning where something's at stake, healthcare, military, defense type things, where we want to practice safe failure is where you're going to see most of this sort of stuff. A second category of serious games is what I call serious games for cognitive development. Now, serious games for cognitive development don't concentrate so much on the situation. They may even take place in a completely abstract space, something that looks nothing like anything. But what they're interested in is presenting an interface that you can use to play through a game. So this is a bit into this game, so this is a little complicated, but this is a game that I built for disaster. It's actually a sort of disaster management game, but the point isn't to become good at disasters, it's to explore human factors. And so this is a game that you play in teams, collaboratively, in a room, and different roles and different responsibilities come into play to create tension in the environment. But there's this idea of a serious game, but it's kind of not in any particular situation. We didn't build the hospital. It wasn't relevant to go and build a 3D hospital to do this. So then on to a couple of others. I'll do COTS first, actually. COTS stands for Commercial Off-the-Shelf Games. And you need to learn from schools with this, because some schools have been fantastic in reusing commercially available titles and repurposing them for learning. There's a couple of environments here. Anybody heard of Minecraft? So Minecraft is huge. It's a 3D world that you can log on and play in, but people have been doing some fantastic pieces of learning within it. You can program within the environment as well. So setting tasks and working collaboratively is just the sort of stuff that happens autonomously in this, but you can build lessons around things that can be learnt there. Another one that I came across not so long ago was Teach with Portals. Anybody come across Portal 2 as a game? So Portal 2, I think, was one of the funniest games I've ever played. It's a fantastic game. It got Stephen Merchant in to voice some of it. It's very, very funny. But fundamentally, it's about physics. And so we can repurpose this game to be used with lessons. So in this case, they get teachers to contribute lesson plans. OK, this is how we can use the game to think about physics, math, chemistry, game design, language, or any of those things. So you're going to use the game that somebody else has developed professionally, because let's face it, this is going to cost a hell of a lot of money to replicate what they've done, and repurpose it. There's a guy called James Paul G who is a big noise in my world, and he talks about the concept of affinity spaces. He talks about the idea of spaces that are outside of the game that allow us to collaborate, communicate, and reflect on what's happened inside the game. Found out that the second biggest wiki after Wikipedia is the World of Warcraft wiki. And this is what guys and girls that are immersed in the world of Warcraft developed a community website totally separate from the game, where they can hang out, contribute tactics, thoughts, ideas, contribute to the sort of the core text of the thing. And this is what we call an affinity space, a place where you can reflect on games outside of the game. It's quite powerful as a teaching aid, I think. So thinking about commercial off-the-shelf games, and of course, a lot of these are free, or nearly free. So they might not be perfect for certain circumstances, but for exploring things that involve reflection, or some more simple things like physics, maths, more simple, then I think commercial off-the-shelf games are quite exciting. My final one was ARGs, alternate reality games. Now, alternate reality games I'm really keen on. And it's not a particularly easy concept to grasp. But in an alternate reality game, the players lose grip on what is actually the game and what's real. And they do this because we've created an alternate reality, a parallel universe. We've only made a minor tweak on our universe for this. We've not made a big tweak. But it was minor enough to be significant. So, for example, this is one that I made earlier. Camden Springs is a failing water cooler company. They're not doing so well. But when we play this ARG in teams, our teams are given a brown paper envelope and a USB stick and said, this company is failing. You've got 3 days to sort it out. Off you pop. They then spend the next 3 days investigating Camden Springs, researching Camden Springs, using the internet and also real life. So if they Google Camden Springs, they will find Camden Springs. Camden Springs is, for all intents and purposes, real. I don't know if my internet's working. It is. And if you want to go and order something from Camden Springs, well, you can. In fact, you can call the call center. If you call the call center, someone will answer the phone. Maybe you place an order. It's a bit of a bad operating system at Camden Springs, to be honest with you. So sometimes you don't get through. Sometimes orders don't get followed up. You can email them. You'll get a response. You can talk to them. In fact, the managing director is going to pop in on day 2, and then other people are as well. And we start to blend this world where actually we're starting to indicate to people that we've got resources everywhere. One of the things I really hate about business learning is that the reliance that it's not really moved on from the Harvard business case for decades. That's how it is. And we all know that when you run a business, when you've got a really big problem, someone presents you a very neat 4 pages describing everything about that problem, And that's kind of what you need to do going about it. So I really like the idea of using an alternate reality, whereby actually trying to get to the root cause of an issue is part and parcel of what you're doing. And of course, we have a presence elsewhere. So, you know, if you start following little things, follow your curiosity, follow it to Twitter, well, then you'll see Canada Springs' Twitter account. Maybe you'll find Rebecca Dellingford. Rebecca Dellingford works for Canada Springs. You can start talking to her. She's starting to bitch about consultants there. And so we're building this alternate reality for people to play around. This costs nothing for us to build. It takes effort, don't get me wrong, but all of these website is built in WordPress. The phone number is a Skype phone number. They're 10 quid. You can use it on 6, 7 computers simultaneously. You can be a call center. Email, fundamentally free. Twitter, other things. All of this can be built at no cost. There's two that I didn't really mention. There's simulations and gamification. Simulations, I kind of think are slightly separate personally. I get into a bit of a trouble with this, thinking that a simulation like a flight simulator isn't inherently a game, kind of lacks some of the features that I tend to find in games. Games tend to have win states. They tend to be a point where there is the opportunity for conflict between you and another player, and simulators don't generally do that, unless you're a pilot and you just celebrate a win every time you land. But, you know, that's kind of the thing you should do anyway. So simulations are one thing, and gamification is another. I've left it out of this because gamification is a personal topic of mine. Interesting topic to anybody, gamification? OK. So I spent a long time thinking about gamification. I used to think that gamification was being playful, was actually the art of taking some of the playful elements out of games and applying them elsewhere. But over time, I've actually sort of receded from that. And I now see gamification as a tool, really, of manipulation's the wrong word, but we're getting that way, into a mechanic to shape behavior. So my definition of gamification is the use of game-like behaviors in non-game environments. So kind of in the definition that it wouldn't be a game, because you've got to be in a non-game environment to be gamification. But this is the idea of using points, levels, badges, other systems like that in order to engage your audience in a journey. I am actually a very big believer. I can talk about gamification a bit more in a bit, so I will come back to that. But there's some really interesting findings we've got from a couple of years' study we've been doing on that. So that's a broad overview. One thing I have skipped by is a definition of games and things like that. It tends to be quite a divisive thing, trying to come up with a single definition of games. I blame game designers. They can't come up with one either. So my personal favourite's from a chap called Bernard Suits, who says that a game is a voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And I kind of like that. It's generic enough to be to apply. So I've talked about game-based learning, Destined, set the periphery a bit. I want to come back to that. But different types of digital games used for learning, I've talked about that. These bottom three, how do you go about designing? What's the real cost? Gamification. What's most interesting? Number one, if you think number one, designing a game, you want to hear about that now? Make a bit of a noise, put your hand up, do something. It's not popular. What's the real cost of making a game? Should we just go to the pub? Gamification have any place in the learning landscape? Should we talk about gamification then? Yes? No? Fine. You're useless, all of you. That's designing a game. You can't have that. That was cost. You can't have that. Quick word on gamification. One of the problems that we have with gamification, or that I perceive with gamification, is, especially when we talk about learning, we're talking about learning as a creative process, talking about something that somebody needs to be immersed in and intrinsically motivated for. And gamification runs the risk of being quite external to that process. It runs the risk of being contingent on things outside of the learning process, so that you end up concentrating more on the goal, on the reward, and not on the process itself. And this is a concern, a legitimate concern. So we did a 2-year study looking at different methods of gamification and the impact they did at the University of Warwick. And one of them, I'm going to show you the results here, was in an online peer-to-peer collaborative learning environment. So peer-to-peer learning has been shown to be effective in facilitating good learning. If nobody does it, it's very poor as an experience. There's nothing sadder than an empty forum. And so getting participation out of people in the peer-to-peer experience was our goal in this particular experiment. So we gamified an environment whereby you got points for making comments and contributions. And this was all done in a peer-to-peer environment. We compared that with a discussion that had been led not by the game and by other people, but by a human, an e-moderator. One of the problems with peer-to-peer learning is that it seems to need a real person to facilitate it. Otherwise, people get off track and it all goes horribly wrong. The trouble is that we don't have that many people. So we've got to find a way of scaling peer-to-peer learning in such a way that you don't necessarily need a human. So this is an experiment there. So we used a measure called cognitive presence to analyze the contributions that people made in a collaborative learning environment. Cognitive presence has 4 levels. Levels 1 and 2 are starting to be critical, but not quite reaching critical thought. And levels 3 and 4 are people that are making comments and contributions that seem to be or appear to be of a critical nature. And by that, I'm talking about people taking 2 or more ideas together, applying it into a personal context, and suggesting how they're going to change or how they have changed as a result of it. So this is the human one. Looked at 1,000, this is not me, this is Kanuka, in 2007, looked at 1,000 responses in a peer-to-peer learning environment that was led by a person. And in terms of quality, about 35% of those contributions were 3 and 4. Pretty good. Same thing, but take out the human and introduce a gamification. Because a big part of what the human does is actually cajole people to do anything. So this is what we were doing with the game. And we found that, which is exactly the same. And the thing that's most astounding about this is the sheer scale of things that are here. We're talking 6,000 contributions, 1,000 contributions, and they're that close. It's a bit subjective. There are some other things that need to be controlled for in there. But fundamentally, where we nailed the gamification, we found quality was exactly the same. It wasn't a problem. So I think gamification in a creative learning environment could be a big thing. But it can go wrong. This is another experiment using the same cognitive presence tool to measure responses. And in this one, we made it contingent that you had to comment, you had to contribute in order to earn the points that you needed to get through the game. 33 students worked for 6 weeks on this. They were all adult, full-time workers working at Warwick Business School for a certification. And between those 33 students, they made 2,217 contributions in 6 weeks. They've all got jobs. Participation wasn't a problem. We came back to measure them with the cognitive presence analysis, and actually it was pretty useless doing the cognitive presence analysis because it turns out 78% of those comments didn't even make the scale. They didn't make it to 1. 2,217 contributions. How many of them made it to level 4? None. That's a lot of work. And we're not convinced we made a difference at all. And this is a really good example of where we'd be patting ourselves on the back, saying, our gamification nailed this. 2,217 comments in a collaborative learning environment. Nailed it. Not one of them was of any real use to anybody. Still got paid. It's all right. Don't worry about it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, you know, like all things in this world, there's good things, there's bad things about gamification. There is a Goldilocks sort of principle of getting it right. And I think the key thing is not making it contingent on completion or something like that, but more concentrating on gamification as a measure of competence, of how I'm progressing in a platform, and doing things that are a little bit outside of your own control. So getting recognition for good work from other people and things like that. I think there's a really big place for this. And I'm really very positive about some of these results, others less so. But I'm a big fan of gamification. We're going to be releasing a paper in the next couple of weeks about all of this. So if you want a copy of that free, you come and see me at the end and give me a card, and I'll drop you the full paper because there's quite a lot of detail in there. So that's kind of interesting. I want to talk about cost for a little bit, because I also have this perception that we're not talking about the cost of these things, and that maybe that's a big problem. Maybe that's a big problem. Maybe that's why we're not doing more games, because they're bloody expensive. So for instance, there's a meta-analysis, a study of studies by a woman called Tracy Sitzman over in the US. And she did a very wide-ranging study on the efficacy of serious games. And she found them to be, on average, about 10% more effective than any other online learning intervention in meeting the learning outcomes. She followed it up with the bombshell that of the games she studied, the average cost was $3 to $5 million. 10%, $3 to $5 million. Yeah, I'm not feeling it. Doesn't have to be the way. So I've talked for a long time, and I'd like you guys to do a bit of work for me. I appreciate not many of you. How many of you have made learning games? Few. So you can talk about those. That's good. Those of you that haven't, I want you to think about learning technology projects, or even, you don't have to be technology projects, learning projects that you've been a part of. And think about this scale. You've got this piece of paper there. One of the things that I'm very keen on is thinking about cost versus impact, because, okay, there is a certain amount of budget in the world, but at the same time, we've got to make sure that we have the most impact for the cost that's appropriate. And what we have here is a thing from operations management called the efficient frontier. The idea is that you should be on this blue line, and that any place on this blue line is the same. So spending very little and having a low impact is exactly the same as spending a heck of a lot and having a very high impact. That's kind of fine. They're all of a point. Just take 5 minutes. You don't have to talk numbers, but think about projects you've worked on. How many of those are kind of you feel on that line? How many of them really went beyond it? How many think they've done projects where actually the impact has been way in excess of what it should have been? And how many of them are down here? Let's take 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, thanks, guys. Thank you very much. I hope you've had good, productive conversations. Still having productive conversations, I see. So, thinking about the sort of how much should a game cost, one of the things I probably should have spent more time talking about was impact as a word, because I'm not necessarily talking about it reaching its objectives or something like that. I think about impact in a much wider basis than just learning. I think games do have a sort of a card up their sleeve there, whereby games do potentially have the ability to go wider than other initiatives. They do have the potential ability to scale in certain circumstances and go further than other things do. So the potential for impact, I think, is huge if it's done right. And so, when I think about projects I've done, no, they're not there. So I think about generally the stuff that we do is down there. So the ARG, for instance, it costs about £5,000 to run one of those, and that's us running the entire back office of everything. The impact is limited to the people that experience it because we can't scale it, but others do scale their ARGs enormously. It's a fantastic one. One of the defining ARGs by a woman called Jane McGarnagle was one called I Love Bees. And this was about actually a marketing ploy for a computer game, kind of ironic. But participants had to trace down clues from all over the place and work them out. And one of the clues, somewhere down the line, ended up working out that a sequence of numbers they'd found on a random website somewhere actually translated to the geolocation coordinates of a series of payphones, 200 payphones that were all across the USA, and a time. And so at that specific time, all of those payphones were rung, and every single one of them got answered. And you think about the enormous impact that people have had where they've got people really into this. They've really got people chasing down rabbit holes to have an enormous impact with what they do. Things like Pony Prep, which I showed you before. Again, quite a simplistic game. That cost about £20,000 to develop. And in the end, we've reached, to date, we've got 100,000 registered kids on that, and there's about 3 million views on the website in the last couple of years. I think that's had pretty good impact. I think that's had pretty good reach around the place. We've done some shockers as well, don't get me wrong. There's been some things that never really get beyond the firewall or never really go anywhere, and perhaps don't even meet their own objectives. And I think that is a risk. But it strikes me that maybe we're being too concerned about spending millions when actually I'd be much preferring to do something quickly, but seeing if we could scale that impact. Anybody, any examples that are willing to share with where it's gone particularly good, particularly bad? Anybody broken that curve? Anybody actually gone so far beyond it that they're over here? Yes? Yes?
It was an e-learning awards winner a couple of years ago.
It was? Okay. E-learning awards winner?
Yeah, car key kept going wrong.
Yeah.
Kept taking it back to the garage, it had to go back to the manufacturer, come back again. And it was just a little tweak inside the cover that needed to be done. And they did a very short little video of how to do it. So the guys in the actual first port of call, the garage, could actually correct it. So it had very low cost, very high impact. The car company saved millions.
And that's the sort of thing that I like to concentrate, is thinking about, okay, if we're going to use a game, or what we're going to do with it, I want to know that we can have impact. I want to know that it's got a potential to scale. I want to know that this isn't going to be something that only 5 or 10 people are going to look at. I want to think that this can have almost limitless impact should we choose to exploit it. And I think a good game can do that. There were plenty of sort of examples, America's Army and things like that, where they've gone out to millions of people. Millions. So games don't have to cost hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds. There are lots of different ways in which you can reuse existing games, create alternate reality games, do simple drill and practice games that actually are very effective, but don't cost the earth. So, showing you that. Last little thing I just wanted to talk about briefly, because I said I would, was designing games. And there was at least Sam who was interested over there. You could be very enthusiastic about this, Sam. So one of the things is about the design process, because it is quite an involved thing, creating a computer game. It is complex. And there are a lot of different sort of skills that could or should be employed. This is a model from Sarah de Freitas, she's quite a good noise in serious games for learning. So if you want a reference point, Sarah de Freitas, she wrote a review of learning in immersive worlds a few years ago, and she's at the Serious Games Institute in Coventry. And she talked about context, pedagogy, the learner, and representation as being the process that she goes through when she's designing a game. So first of all, she thinks about the context. What context is this game going to be played in? Is it going to be online, offline, in the room, real time, turn-based? What's the context that this game is going to be played in? Who and where are they going to play it? Then she thinks about learning. One of the really interesting things is that I think a lot of learning designers sit there and think we should go and learn from game designers, because game designers know an awful lot that we should know. And game designers are sat there going, we should really go and talk to some learning designers, because I really want to know how we can do some of this. Somewhere in there's a sweet spot. But Sarah's talking about understanding whether we're looking at situated, cognitive, associative sort of things that we're trying to achieve within a game. Then thinking about the learner. People get hung up on demographics too quickly about games, that games don't appeal to women, that games don't appeal to people over 30 and things like that. It's just nonsense. Everything that spills out suggests that increasingly women are nudging up and beyond, in some cases, 50% of gamers around the place, and that the average age of a gamer is in their mid-30s. So actually, this sort of thing with the advent of small casual games that you might have on an iPhone, I'm going to stand still. You know, there's every opportunity to suggest that games can appeal to everyone and everywhere, and that they're not necessarily about a demographic. There are lots of different types of people who like to play lots of different types of games. Some people like to collaborate, some like to destroy, some like to do things on their own, some like to do things in a social environment. But there's all sorts of them. The final one is representation, thinking about how we're going to represent this in a game. What are we going to do to... Can you hear me still? Can you hear me still?
Is someone coming on the frequency? That's the thing.
It's that bloody Lord Putnam, isn't it? He's out to... OK, fine. I knew Lord Putnam would do something. Representation is thinking about how you're going to represent yourself in the world. What are you going to do? We'll go for this. What are you going to do to give an environment that allows people to either be a 3D avatar or to move around in space in whatever way they need to? And this is where you might think about what sort of game is going to be played here about representation as well. I have a different model which I adopted from social sort of circles called POST. POST is about people, objectives, strategy, and technology. People is about understanding the person, understanding your audience, understanding the sorts of things they like. Objectives is about thinking about the objectives, the outcomes that you'll know you've been successful in this game when this happens. And we're not talking about 100% of people having completed the game or a lot of people having played the game, but of course linking it back to real-world change in your organization. We think about things in terms of 5 operations metrics, in terms of cost, speed, dependability, flexibility, quality. These are the sorts of returns, these are the sorts of objectives I want to be reaching for in a game, that I can tangibly measure these improvements. Strategy is the S in post, and that's thinking about the sort of game you might like, how you might approach it, whether it's a game at all. One of the best exercises, if somebody comes to you and says, we've got to build this game, is to ask them to go away and come up with the next best alternative. If you didn't build a game, what else would it be? The answer has got to be that they come back and say, the only way this could ever really work is if it's like this, as opposed to, I think it would be cool that we did a game. I want to know what else you could do that would meet these objectives with these people. Next best alternatives are really a key part of the strategy. And the final bit is technology. The final thing you should be thinking about is how you're going to do it. You know, we have organizations that invest huge amounts of money in iPads and then come to us and says, we really need to do something with these iPads. Game? And, you know, it's just the wrong way around. So Sarah de Freitas is a very good person to learn from on learning design. Kind of coming all the way back to the top now. I'm running out of time. 5 minutes. I have run out of time. It still comes back to that top thing. Is game-based learning destined to sit on the edge of things? I don't know. I feel like maybe we're at a tipping point. I think maybe that with online learning generally becoming more mainstream, more focused in the media, that maybe there's an opportunity to suggest that this sort of strategy is part of that. But I think you've got to get beyond the idea that game-based learning is one thing and that it's going to be the answer to all prayers or anything like that. It's a mistake to think that they cost a lot. Some games cost a lot. Some games cost nothing. It's a mistake to think that they all come under the same umbrella of game-based learning. And I think there's plenty of evidence out there to suggest that games can be as effective or more effective than other like interventions, including in the classroom, which incidentally staggers quite a long way behind in some of the statistics. So, I don't know is the answer. Sorry, wasted an hour of your life. I hope that's been okay. We've got a few minutes for any questions, if anybody has any. Sarah de Freitas. She's at the Serious Games Institute in Coventry. Okay. I like that as an idea. One of the other things that I suggest, if you are thinking about designing or a game or something like that, is to play more games. You know, I think that's the first point, is to sit there and see what's already out there, what other people are doing. I think that's a big part of the philosophy, is to do something like that. And you're right, you know, you look at everywhere from the gamification of Khan Academy and Code Academy to the sort of brain teaser games and everything in between. Learning is happening with games. Whether we as an industry choose to accept that is probably a very good point. You should really do this sort of speaking thing. Very good.
The bigger barrier, it's not a question, she's more a point for discussion.
Of course.
The biggest barrier to me, I think, is the perception.
Mm.
So anything that appears to be actually fun in a training environment is regarded by those commissioning us as being a waste of time. And I know from experience of doing sort of proof of learning quizzes, and a senior manager walks in, you know, the comments you get at the next meeting is, every time I walk in the training room, there are people playing games and doing quizzes, and well, you know, why aren't they learning?
It's fabulous, isn't it? How we mixed up these terms. You know, think about the way that as toddlers, as children, we play, explore, and learn. And the most positive time of our lives, as we're learning the most, is when we're most playful. And at the same time, there's been this perception that work and play are kind of the opposite terms to each other. But for me, the opposite of being at play is being bored. It's not anything to do with work. It's you know, you can do both. It's not a problem there. But getting over that. The trouble is that I don't often meet the people that have that opinion. It might be because I work in game-based learning circles, but everyone says, I don't think like this, but these people think about it. Fine. I think it's a good point, yes. So.
There's an intrinsic problem with the word play. Games aren't necessarily playful. They might be challenging and rewarding and immersive. They aren't necessarily fun.
It's kind of interesting. There's a book by a guy called Raf Costa, who's called A Theory of Fun for Game Design. And his philosophy is that actually the very act of learning is fun. It is the very act of doing something new in a different way and being successful in it that propagates fun. That's his take on that sort of thing. And there's also another guy called Mark LeBlanc, who I often call Matt LeBlanc. And he talks about there being 8 types of fun, of there being different sorts of fun around the place that you can have. So, you know, there's a heck of a lot of theories as to whether fun is relevant to these sorts of things or not. Also, there's a guy called Jesse Schell who writes about this sort of stuff, and he suggests that the definition of a game is a problem-solving activity approached with a playful attitude. For some people, it's core. For others, it's not. And, you know, I think it's a really interesting thing. I think we get quite philosophical quite quickly when we talk about play and games and fun. Probably doesn't help ourselves, but at the same time, it's a really interesting area.
Any more questions? One more? Okay, well, thanks very much.